Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 7th of February of 2023. Today we have some updates, so let's start. First we're going to start with the Kupiansk frontline. With this area we are going to start from the north. As you can see, the Russian sources map has been updated. Now the towns like Liman I, Dvorechna are under Russian control. This territory haven't been colored yet, but I believe that within the next few days the Russians will update the map and they will add the color. Very interesting situation about Sinkovka. If you remember, during the previous few days the Russians reported that as a result of their offensive operation in this area, the Ukrainians were forced to step back from Sinkovka, but the Russian sources map isn't updated. This town is still considered as the territory under Ukrainian control, and that this town is not even in the gray zone. But this is not the most important thing. I believe that in a day or two we're going to see more updates. When talking about Kupiansk itself, if you remember, yesterday I told you that we can say that yesterday was the first day of the battle for Kupiansk, and it's true. Today we receive a lot of updates from Kupiansk. The Western sources, the Ukrainian sources and the Russian sources are saying that the Ukrainians took a decision to start small regrouping in this area. Mainly this considers the situation with artillery systems. The Ukrainians took a decision to stay on the safe side, and they moved all their or at least maybe more than 50%, I can't tell even the number, but a lot of artillery systems the Ukrainians decided to deploy on the west side of Oskol River. It is a very important update because if you remember, if you follow the video, I always, when talking about the report of Ministry of Defense, I always add some information about artillery duels. And when talking about Kupiansk front line, the Russians reported that during the previous weeks and months of artillery duels, mainly they destroyed artillery systems like Howitzer D30 or Howitzer D20 or M777 artillery systems. So as you understand, mainly the Ukrainians lost those types of artillery systems that need carriers. So that means that to be on the safe side, and if the Russians start the offensive operation, it is better to move these artillery systems that need carriers on the west side, on the west bank of the Oskol River, just not to lose these artillery systems during the offensive operation from the Russian side. From this point, from this perspective, this is a very smart step. This is not like a smart step, this is the step that the Ukrainians was as must to do, so they didn't have any other option. But the thing is that because of the fact that Ukrainians were forced to redeploy a lot of artillery systems, and I believe that those artillery systems that need carriers, now we understand that artillery pressure on the Kupiansk front line was decreased from the Ukrainian side. And that means that the Russians now has more possibilities and more, I believe, power to push the Ukrainians in the vicinity or on the Kupiansk front line. When talking about this area, the Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost 50 soldiers, 6 armored vehicles, and 1 D30 howitzer. So as we discussed, those howitzers that need carriers. Furthermore, the Russians were attacking 14th Mechanized Brigade, 92nd Mechanized Brigade, and mainly the Russians were attacking these brigades in the vicinity of towns Berestova, this is Berestova, Novoselovskaya, and Ivanovskaya. So we see that the Russians pushes. I believe that they have slowed down a little bit. They have a lot of work to do. They need to complete clearing operation of Dvorechna, Gryanikivka, Первый Liman, and maybe to complete clearing of Sinkovka, and after that they will start storming of Kupiansk. Now let's move to Liman frontline. As you can see, there are a lot of icons in this area. The Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainian losses were around 100 soldiers and 5 armored vehicles. During the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians haven't lost any artillery system. The Russians were attacking 66th Mechanized Brigade, 25th Brigade, 95th Brigade, and 81st Air Assault Brigade. In the towns like Novosada, Nevskaya, Chervona Popovka, this is Chervona Popovka, Dibrova, This is in the vicinity of Dubrova, in the forest of Serebryanka forest, and so on. We haven't received any updates about any movements from the Russian side in direction of Yampulovka and Terny, but I believe that the Russians are already in the vicinity or on the edge of those towns. When talking about the Institute of Study of War map, you're going to see the real Russian claims in these front line. As you can see, according to this orange cloud, the Russians are saying that they have almost entered a town like Yampolovka and a town like Terny on the south. So they're very close to this area. Furthermore, when talking one more time about Kupiansk front line, as you can see, according to the Russians' claims, they entered Sinkovka, but the Russian source map wasn't updated. Anyway, I believe that in a day or two we're going to see updates on this area. Now let's move to Seversk front line, and this is the most interesting front line because during the previous 24 hours we received a lot of updates from both sides, from the Ukrainians and from the Russians, and all of them were very sometimes opposite. Sometimes different Russian sources are saying completely opposite things, and the most important area, one of the most important area in this bridgehead is the town by the name of Bilogorovka. Because as you can see, the Russian sources map has been updated. You see this gray line, and according to this line, the north part of Bilogorovka is under Russian control. But when talking about the landfill and this industrial area, these two blocks, these two bridgeheads are under Ukrainian control. And some Russian sources are saying that these guys, the Ukrainian guys, are encircled. Maybe they still have ammo and have a lot of manpower, and to hold the circle defense. Anyway, they are still there, and the Russians don't control the entire Bilogorovka bridgehead. Furthermore, when talking about the Russians, they are saying that after taking this part of Bilogorovka, they started counter-offensive operation, and as a result of that counter-offensive operation, the Russians managed to return control over more than 2 kilometers. So when talking about Bilogorovka, and if we calculate 2 kilometers, so I believe that that's it. So the Russians may be somewhere on this line. It's a forest that it's some kind of area between Bilogorovka and Serebryana and Grigorievka. Without significant success, maybe they just got the vicinity or the edge of Grigorievka, nothing more. But the Ukrainians maybe still remains or located in this small industrial zone. When talking about the south area, there are very heavy clashes all over the front line, starting from Sporne, let's say, to the north of Bakhmut. And as you can see, the Russians, they're not stopped by the Ukrainians, but they are slowed down. So the Russians reached some defense line of the Ukrainians, and now they need to spend some time to reduce this defense line till ruins. When talking about the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense report, today they reported for the first time since the beginning of the special operation that they managed to repulse the Russians offensive operation in direction of Zaliznyansk. As you can see, the Western source map added AK-47 icon showing the Russian movement in this direction. When talking about the head of DPR, today he reported that the Russians achieved significant success on the Seversk front line, and he was talking about the bridgehead in the vicinity of Sakovantseti and Nikolaevka. He was saying that the Russians developed some bridgehead in direction of Vasikovka, in direction of Fedorovka, and in direction of Razdolovka. But as you can see, all these towns are still under Ukrainian control. So that means that maybe the Russians managed to get the vicinity, the edge of these towns or so on. But anyway, these towns are still under Ukrainian control. And when talking about the Ukrainians, of course, it's very good for them because they have time for regrouping, they have time to bring more reserves, and the most important, the Ukrainians have time to prepare another defense line somewhere between Slaviansk and Seversk, and I believe that they're doing this right now. Now we're moving to the north of Bakhmut. Today there is also an icon on the Russian sources map, development in direction of Zaliznyansk, and let's try to understand the real situation in the north of Bakhmut. As you can see, there are at least few towns, few blocks that has very big importance for the Russians. First of all is Krasnaya Gora, this one. This is the I believe the most important area, or at least the area where we can find the heaviest clashes these days. Another town that located on the west from Krasnaya Gora is Paraskoyevka. On the south, there are at least 3 places, 3 blocks: Verkhovka, Yagidne, and the railroad station Stupki. This railroad station. So four areas: Krasnaya Gora, Paraskoyevka, Verkhovka, Yagidne, and Stupki. This is the bridgehead that the Russians need to take control over if they want to cut the north support of Bakhmut. And this is going to be north encirclement. And if the Russians are able to take any of these towns, but not maybe Krasnaya Gora is not enough to take just one Krasnaya Gora. They need to take, let's say, if the Russians are able to take Verkhovka or Paraskoyevka or Yagidne or the railroad station Stupki, that means that they establish operational encirclement of Bakhmut. Krasnaya Gora is just the gates that the Russians are trying to open since Solidar offensive operation. But as you can see, the Russians push to the north, to be more precise, to the northwest in direction of Zheleznyanska. And I will try to explain to you what is the situation in this area and why the Russians are slowed down and they can't do any progress in this area. But before that, just one more time. The Russians reported that when talking about Donetsk frontline, the Ukrainians lost around 90 soldiers, 4 armored vehicles, and 2 artillery systems, 1 Grad and another M-Stab-B howitzer. Also, the Ukraine lost 1 ammo depot. So let's start from Krasnaya Gora. As you can see, there is an icon in this area, and the Russians reported, to be more precise, the Wagners reported that by the 7th of February, the Russians control around 40 or 50% of this town. You can say that that's a lot, and the Russians have almost completed their mission of taking Krasnaya Gora, but this is not, it's not true, because they have, maybe the Russians control 50%, maybe the Russians control 70%, or maybe 80% of Krasnaya Gora. It doesn't matter, because the Russians need to take the last 10%, and I believe that they need to spend energy and time and to do as much as a job to take these 10% as they did before to take the previous 90%. First of all, if you take a look at Krasnaya Gora, you're going to see that we can split this town in 3 blocks: the northwest block, the southwest block, and the east block. The east block is a residential area with the small buildings and the forest around this territory, and this is exactly the area that the Russians are using to attack the western part of Krasnaya Gora. When talking about the north part of Krasnaya Gora, you're going to see that there is a residential area with the high buildings, this one. And as we know, the Russians have a lot of problems with these high buildings. If you remember, the last time the Russians were attacking the high buildings in the south of Bakhmut in Opotne, it took them around 2 months to penetrate Opotne and to get control over, not to get control, but to reduce these buildings still ruins, and after that they were able to enter this residential area with the small buildings. The same situation in Krasnaya Gora. I'm not saying that the Russians need months to reduce these buildings, but at least if they have a lot of artillery power and they are able to use this power at the same time on this particular front line, maybe it will take a week or 2 just to ruin these buildings, and after that they will be able to continue their offensive operation. The question is whether the Russians have these weeks or even a week to destroy these buildings and after that to move further. I'm not sure they have. They need to find another solution. When talking about south area, you're going to see this in residential area, this industrial zone with another high building on the south. So it looks like a very nice fortification that Ukrainian uses to stop the Russian offensive operation from the south. Let's take a look at the Western Sources map and let's add these icons on this area. First of all, the south fortification, this one. So the Ukrainians have their position there, and let's say the north fortification along this residential area. So as you can see, when the Russians attack from the north, the Ukrainians uses this northeast fortification to slow down, to stop the Russians. When they try to develop their offensive operation from Podgorodny in direction of Krasnaya Gora, the Ukrainians uses these fortifications to stop the Russians. Furthermore, as you can see, there is a river. So that means that the Russians, if they want to attack in the direction of Krasnaya Gora, they can do this just from Podgorodny or from the north of Krasnaya Gora, but not from Paraskoyevka side. So on this side. So it's not an easy job. The only possible thing that the Russians can do if they want to speed up this operation is to attack in the middle between these two fortifications. Let's return back to the Russian sources map. So this is the first fortification, this is the north, and I'm talking about this area, central part, this marked with the area, exactly this icon located above this territory. So if the Russians are able to attack in the middle and to split these two fortifications, first the south fortification will fall, and after that this north one will fall as well. I believe that the middle part fortifications, there are no fortifications at all, as you can see. There are just small buildings that I believe it won't take much time for the Russians to ruin this area and to move further. So I believe this is exactly what the Russians are doing right now. They're trying to attack in the middle part of Krasnaya Gora, and this attack can speed up the entire operation, and within the next few days the entire Krasnaya Gora will fall. Furthermore, but the Russians can't risk anyway. They're working according to timings, and as I understand, the Russian army in Belgorod, on Liman front, on Kupiansk front line, they are waiting the fall or encirclement of Artyomovsk from the north, and after that they will start their own offensive operation. And so that's why the Russians need to hurry up, they need to speed up, and as you can see, they have changed their focus. If you remember, at first they were trying to take control over Krasnaya Gora and Paraskoevka after Solidar operation, but as you can see, they were stopped by the Ukrainians, and now they're stuck in this area, and that's why the Russians took a decision to change their focus and to start movement to the south. And during the previous days, they were mainly concentrated on the railroad station Stupki. Let's call it this region as the vicinity of railroad station Stupki, and as a result of that attack, they managed to establish control over this north corner. There are a few buildings, just 2 or 3 streets, and the Russians control this area, and from this area they will try to develop their offensive operation to the south. And anyway, when talking about this bridgehead, about Paraskoevka, Verkhovka, Yagidna, Stupki, Krasnaya Gora, the most important area is this triangle between Verkhovka, let's say Yagidna, the bridge, and so this is the most important triangle because this is a support triangle that Ukrainians still uses for supplying, supporting of the Ukrainians who are located in Bakhmut. And if the Russians are able to attack in direction of Stupki, or it doesn't matter if the Russians are able to take this railroad station or not. The question is, or the thing is, the goal is to develop as much as possible, to get as close as possible, or to establish visual control over the cross in Berkhovka, or to establish some physical or artillery of fire control, close combat control over Yagidna and this cross. If the Russians are able to do this, we can say about the encirclement of Bakhmut from the north, and from that moment it will be completely two different armies. I'm talking about the Seversk army, or even we can't even call this army as the Seversk army. We're going to say that if the Russians are able to establish control over this triangle, to split this army into parts, we can say about Bakhmut garrison, about Seversk garrison, and let's say about, I don't know, Paraskoevka garrison or something like this, Paraskoevka Zaleznyanska. So this middle one, it will be completely different army, completely separate army with separate supply and support roads and so on. And of course, it will be much more easier for the Russians to move further. So the Russians change their focus and they're moving to the south. To tell the truth, I don't believe that the Russians are able to take control over Paraskoevka by attacking Krasnaya Gora and so on. To take Paraskoevka, the only way to do this is to attack from Blagodatne. And the Russians made a few attempts of that attack the previous weeks, but where they were stopped by the Ukrainians, and we can understand why. Because first of all, there are two barriers. First of all, the river Bakhmut, this one on, let's say, on the east, and there is another north on the northwest, is small lake, this one. So there is a very short road that the Russians can use to attack Paraskoevka. And of course, you need to understand that there are a lot of fortification, trenches, all type of things that Ukrainians can build just to slow down the Russians, and of course to attack this area in front is suicide operation. So this is the reason the Russians took a decision to encircle, or to encircle to make a small hook and to attack Paraskoivka from the back. So this is the reason why this icon of AK-47 appeared on the map, on the Western sources and on the Russian sources. The Russians just tried to make a small hook to develop bridgehead. Furthermore, I believe that these trenches that located in front of railroad stations still under Ukrainian control. So by developing this bridgehead, they will be able to cut supply roads that Ukraine uses. And when talking about this area, we understand that this is the road that Ukrainians use to supply. By developing this area, they will establish physical, visual control over this bridgehead, and the most important, they will be able to take Paraskoivka and they will be able to get M03 road. So this is the plan of the Russians, but it also will take time, because the problem is that there is a river, there is a railroad station, and there is a very small bridgehead of the Russians on this bank of, let's say, Bakhmut river. I'm talking about Blagodatная, and all these entire river, all the bridges, everything is under complete and drone control from the Ukrainian side. I believe that Ukrainians managed to move a lot of artillery systems on all these bridges is under fire control, and because of the fact that bridgehead is very short, very small, the Russians can't move a lot of armored vehicles. They can't, because if they move a lot, they will over concentrate their bridgehead with their armored vehicles, and they will be destroyed easily. They can use a small group, small portions of these armored vehicles, and to move very slowly, step by step. As soon as they develop bridgehead on this area, they will move enough. But to do this, they need to take Paraskoivka. But to take Paraskoivka, they need more armored vehicles, more push forces, more storm forces. But to do this, they need to bring more. To bring more, they will over-concentrate the forces and they will attack by the Ukrainians. So as you can see, there is a very interesting circle in this situation, and now the Russians try to find a solution how to develop anything and to get as much as possible from this situation. Now we are moving to the south. When talking about the Bakhmut itself, the Russians are pushing from the east, and I believe that within the next few days or maybe a week, the Russians will push the Ukrainians on the west side of Bakhmut river, and the entire east part of Bakhmut will be under Russian control. Furthermore, the Ukrainian sources are saying that by today the Russians establish control over around 33% of Bakhmut. So maybe, I won't be surprised if the Ukrainians take a decision to step back from this bank of the river. Now let's move to Ivanovskaya, to this area. As you can see, this is the second area that the Russians these days, these hours, are trying to establish control over, just to cut the N32 road and to encircle and establish operational control of Bakhmut from the south. But as you can see, the Russians are slowed down in this area as well, and there are also a lot of explanation in this situation. When talking about the Russian sources map, as you can see, the Russians took a decision made to move along the canal, this canal in direction of the road T0504, this one, and they were pretty successful, and they are still pretty successful in these movements, but there is an important thing. So the Russians are moving along the canal. First of all, this movement is pretty secured because they have protection as the canal on the west, so that's why their flanks are secured, and they, of course, it's dangerous. There are a lot of snipers on that side of the river. There are not much brushes, not much forest lines on the west side, so there are not much places where the Ukrainians can hide, so that's why this movement is pretty secured, so they can get N32 road easily. But there is one important problem in front of the Russians, and I'm talking about this field, this one. As you can see, there is a forest. This forest, there is north part forest, south, and let's say east, and there is a field right exactly in the middle of this forest, and there is just a small road that connects these fields, this one, and this is the only road that the Russians are able to use to develop their offensive operation to the north in direction of this road. What does it mean? That means that the north, I believe that the north forest is under complete Ukrainian control. There are a lot of places where they can hide, there are a lot of trenches, these forests are mined, and I don't think that it's a very big deal or problem for the Ukrainians to keep their forces in this part of the river and to control every single movement in this part of the forest. I don't think that it's a very big problem and from the Ukrainian side, but it's a huge problem from the Russian side. Believe me, the Russians are not, they can't use the field to attack for many reasons. First of all, they can't bring the armored vehicles to this field because there is a forest in this area. And when talking about infantry, they will be just destroyed while movement. They are very slow, and to cross this field is a very big problem for the Russians. So as we understand, the Russians got very close to this road, but I believe that this fortification of the Ukrainians in the forest in Ivanovska still is a very powerful fortress, and I believe that the Russians need to spend a lot of time before cracking this nut, and after that maybe they will be able to achieve something. So this is the problems. The Ukrainians, furthermore, when talking about the Institute of Study of War, you're going to see another problem about the south part of Bakhmut, and the problem is that this is the forest, this is the road, that when talking about the west part, there is 3 hills, 251 meters, 254, 256, all these hills located on the Ukrainian side, and they can control every single Russian movement from these hills. They are able to see a lot, and they are able to see much more than the Russians do. So this is also another problem that the Russians need to solve, and I believe that the Russians are able to solve. But the question is what price they're going to pay and how much time they're going to spend for this operation. Maybe this is the reason why the Russians decided to change their focus and to start movements in direction of Seversk. I don't know. Very difficult to understand. I believe that maybe the Russians use the tactic of attack all over the front line and to follow every single operation. And if at some certain point of front line the operation is pretty successful, maybe they will make a faster grouping and they will try to develop. Because I believe there are a lot of options. We discussed many times the possible direction, but for now we see that every single direction are developed, but without any significant progress, and this is very interesting. Now let's move to Marinka. As you can see, there are still a lot of heavy clashes in Marinka. The Russians today also confirmed and reported that they promised, maybe even tomorrow, they will announce about establishing control over entire Marinka for 100%. So we heard that in December. We haven't heard about this in January. The Russians reported they took a decision to slow down, and today they confirmed one more time that maybe even tomorrow we're going to see or hear another update that Marinka will fall and the Russians will establish entire control over this area. Can't tell you, can't agree or not agree, we'll see. Anyway, we'll see. Now, when talking about Ugledar, the Russians reported that Ukrainians started their own counter-offensive operation in this area. As we know from as a result of previous offensive operation from the Russian side, the Russians did manage to establish control over the residential area that located on the east from Ugledar and so on. And they established the bridgehead, and this is very painful bridgehead for the Ukrainians. First of all, this bridgehead cut this territory in 2 parts, Ugledar itself and the coal mine by itself. So the Ukrainians need to push the Russians back from this area just to be on the safe side or something like this. Furthermore, the Russians from these bridgeheads are able to control the Ukrainians on this part of Ugledar, and they are able to navigate. They don't need to fight, they need to storm, they just need to find a safe position in this area and to navigate and target the Russians artillery, the Russians other type of forces, their attacks against the first defense line in Ugledar. So the Ukrainians started counter-offensive operation. The Russians reported that by this evening there were 4 waves of counter-offensive operation, and according to the Russian sources they managed to repulse every single wave of those offensive operations. So we'll see. Anyway, now the front line is active on Ugledar, but this front line is active from the Ukrainian side, and they want to push the Russians back from this residential area. When talking about the entire results of the previous 24 hours, the Russians were attacking 1st Tank Brigade and 72nd Brigade in the vicinity of Ugledar and in the vicinity of Vadiana. So when talking about Vadiana, I believe that Ukrainians used their tank brigade first in this area to slow down the Russian movements in this area. Furthermore, the Russians reported that they managed to destroy up to 4 ammo depot in this area. When talking about Kherson, the Russians continued their effective artillery duels And they reported that as a result of artillery duels in this area, they destroyed one EMU depot, 20 Ukrainian soldiers, and one howitzer Akatsiya. So as you can see, the front lines are very active all over the front line. The Russians are a little bit slowed down in the vicinity of Bakhmut. We heard a lot about the very bad situation of the Ukrainians. The Western sources are saying that the Ukrainians soon they will take a decision to step back. But during this video, I tried to explain to you that yes, the Ukrainians have a lot of problems, but the positions that they control are not so bad. And these positions like Krasnaya Gora, Paraskoyevka, these railroad stations and so on, these forests near Ivanovska, can give them 1 or maybe 2 weeks of defense. And I believe that these 2 weeks may be enough for the Ukrainians to prepare another defense line along the canal near Chasov Yar, because this is going to be the next defense line or the next front line, the border front line of the next stage of special military operation. When talking about the Russians, I see that I don't know the real situation of Wagner's in the vicinity of Krasnaya Gora, just my understanding of the situation, right? But I think that the thing that the Russians can do, they need to increase the pressure on Liman frontline. Liman frontline, Yampol in this area, and of course Kupiansk. If they're a little bit slowed down in this area, I don't think they need to push their soldiers in direction of suicide operation. If it is difficult to cross, then you need to activate your movements on some other front line and to force the Ukrainians to use reserves from Bakhmut and to move them to the north. Now the Russians can create a lot of logistic problems for the Ukrainians, and these logistic problems can bring significant. These Ukrainians' logistic problems can bring significant success for the Russians. And when talking about the Ukrainians, they need to stabilize the front lines, because if they are not able to stabilize, and even uncomfortable, very bad front line, if they're not able to stabilize it, then they will be forced to use their reserves, and using reserves can bring a lot of logistic problems for them. And the most important, I believe that within the next few days we're going to see another missile and drone attack, and this is going to be some kind of I don't know how to call it, maybe some kind of flag or signal of ending of some period, of some small part of this battle for Ugledar, Bakhmut, Solidar, and something new is going to be started after that attack. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel is reminded to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.